Good morning, everyone. Today, we're live with Meghan Stevenson-Krausz, who is the CEO of Diversity VC, a nonprofit dedicated to building a venture capital sector that is inclusive and reflective of the society we all live in. Over the past decade, Diversity VC has worked with funds globally to improve how capital is allocated through research, through data, and through practical frameworks like the Diversity VC standard. Meghan has just led the organization's 10-year impact report, which looks at what has changed in venture over the past decade and what still needs to change. Let's dive into it, Meghan. Tell us everything.
Thank you so much, Andreas. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Okay. So basically, we set out 10 years ago, or I say we, the founders of Diversity VC, to understand better like who's in the sector, right? We knew that from just anecdotally in our own experiences that there was a lack of diversity, but we didn't have the numbers behind it, right? And so that first report in 2017, Women in UK Venture Capital, was backed by then the BBCA, now UK Private Capital and Craft. And we finally had numbers to say like, okay, there's a problem. About half of the UK workforce is women, but less than 30%, 27% of VCs were women, right? And so basically, while originally we thought, okay, if we have the data, we can change it, we realized that actually we needed to be a little bit more intentional about that. And so that's why we started trying to build solutions instead of just, we've continued to track the data because it's important to have it. What you're not measuring, you can't change. But we realized that we also needed to build solutions.
Tell me, 10 years in, do you feel like we're making progress?
Yeah, yes and no, right? And so I mentioned we felt the need to build solutions. The two areas that we most felt we should focus on were access, so who gets into venture, and then decision making, right? Because we all know we're human. Bias is like the most human thing there is. I don't know if anybody here has read the book Blink. Have you read Blink by Malcolm Gladwell? Yeah, so, right, like we all have to make these really split-second decisions quickly using the information we have. The world is chaotic. Bias plays a role in that, right? So that is why we developed Future VC, which is a program to help get people into venture. And through that program, we've actually trained more than 600 individuals. We've placed more than 100 of them into internships in funds. And then of those more than 100 that were in internships and funds, actually 97% of them got full-time roles in venture afterwards. So that's changing who's getting into venture, right? But one of the things that we started to notice is that while we were seeing a diversification of folks in entry-level roles, they were moving up a little bit and then moving out. And so that's why we've also started running a program for folks, senior associates and principals, to help to accelerate that path to partner, break that sort of final glass ceiling there.
Yeah, there are some people that say that the reason why a lot have moved out is also because we kind of have a timing where venture was very open to a lot of people that normally maybe wouldn't get in because funds were growing and it was sexy for everyone to get into all that stuff. And then we had the reset, which made a lot of people that, like, unless you were really committed to it and quite far in your career, to be honest, as well, then there was just a time where the industry was called. Do you have any views on whether there was an overculling of diversity profiles versus the more standard, or was it following trends?
Yeah, so I think to answer that, I actually want to look at like where investors are investing in those moments as well, right? And so what we do see is that investors tend to sort of regress to their safe baseline. And what that looks like is often straight white men who went to certain schools. No offense. That's just right. That's just sort of like the norm that we consider when we think of a founder or even an investor, because investors tend to invest in people like them. So they're regressing to this, but actually, I think if we look at what builds a resilient and innovative company, we know that actually diversity of thought is really critical for that, right? And Matthew Said's book Rebel Ideas does an incredible job of summarizing this. I highly recommend it. And we also know that it takes work to manage diverse teams. And that's where the Diversity VC standard comes in, right? And so that's where we really are focusing on how are funds building inclusive governance structures. What kind of policies do they have in place? Do they have a code of conduct that not only is talking about the types of activities they don't want to see, but is actually promoting this is the culture we want to see in our organization? Training people, VCs are notoriously flat, but are they really training people on how to manage their teams? And also making sure you have like equal family leave policies, right? And that people are actually taking that opportunity to men and women, birth parent or not, to be at home with the child when they come. And then looking at hiring practices and mitigating bias in those, as well as in due diligence and investment decision making. Because at the end of the day, and ultimately, this is really just good HR practices. That's how you manage diverse teams well, and you actually get folks to be able to feel they can show up as their full selves. You increase retention. It's expensive to replace people. And so, you increase retention, you increase productivity, and also get the benefit of the sort of diversity of thought, resilience, innovation, et cetera.
You spoke about in the beginning that, yes, getting data was good and great, but unfortunately, you could also see that you had to be more intentional and more thoughtful about where you're trying to move the needle. Where have you focused, and where have you seen that focus come into being and be real results?
Yeah. So I think like the biggest lesson learned over the last 10 years is just that good intentions, they're good, but they're not enough. And so that's why we've really focused on the diversity VC standard. It's like super unsexy. And I know that there's this tendency in the sector to be like, I know it when I see it. But that's where bias really gets to creep in a lot in subjectivity. And so that's why it's like we know that the best way to mitigate bias is to create structures that are repeatable. And so that's where we focused. And what we've seen is that actually funds that go through the standard, they increase the gender diversity on their teams by 10%. They're increasing ethnic representation across the board. And most surprisingly or significantly, we actually saw that in funds that implemented that went through the diversity VC standard, they had 2 times the representation of Black professionals in senior investment roles from after they went through the certification process from before. Now, I think it's important to say, look, this is not a controlled experiment. I cannot say that this is causation, and certainly the majority of the funds that come to us and go through the standard, they're choosing to do so of their own volition. So they're already aware that this is something that's important to them and that they want to make a change. But I still think it shows that like where you can put in structure, we see more diversity and it's more successful.
Can you cast a bit more light on the diversity VC standard? What is it exactly? What do funds that attend go through?
Yeah, of course. So it's basically a benchmarking tool and diagnostic for VC funds where we look all the way across the board from the policies and practices that you have in place through to the way that you interact with the market and with your own investors in terms of the data you're collecting and the way that you're reporting out. And then interactions with founders from the moment that they enter top of funnel through to making an investment. How do you mitigate bias in that process? And how do you support your portfolio founders once you've invested in also building more inclusive cultures?
If you were to pull up anyone that have made any one firm where you feel like this firm has made incredible progress, can you talk a bit about that as a case study that without naming them necessarily?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not allowed to have favorites, right? But I do think that there is one fund in particular, and they're a pretty big fund, one of the larger funds in Europe that I think really exemplifies the purpose behind the diversity VC standard. And so we do not necessarily advocate, like if you as a fund want to have a DEI strategy, that is your decision, right? Like we are not here to tell you what your investment thesis should be. That is the like bread and butter of the fund. And at the same time, we are trying to promote the consideration of inclusion and diversity as part of the business strategy, right? And so, what this fund did when they were going through the standard is they really took a step back and said, okay, why do we even care about diversity? And what they said is, okay, well, we care about diversity because at the end of the day, we care about diversity of thought, right? Like they're trying to invest in the best companies, unicorns, future unicorns in Europe. And so what does diversity of thought mean for them? And so they said, okay, it means to us gender, ethnicity, or rather these are the factors we think contribute to diversity of thought: gender, ethnicity, nationality, and socioeconomic background were the sort of the areas that they felt, okay, this is what can contribute to diversity of thought. Now, the first couple are fairly easy to ask top of funnel, just because they're information either you can find out publicly or people are more comfortable talking about. But socioeconomic background is not something that most people are comfortable talking about. It's not like that sort of first thing. And so they said, okay, these first couple, we can talk about them, we can ask about it top of funnel. But when it comes to socioeconomic diversity, we need to develop something in our due diligence process, some questions that we ask to understand a bit more about their background. And why are we trying to get at that? And at the end of the day, a lot of it comes to resilience and how have you overcome certain obstacles to get to where you are today. And so I just think that is a really good example of the thought exercise that we try to encourage through the standard. And because at the end of the day, if you're not building it into the business model of your fund, then it's not going to become integral and it's going to be the first thing to go in markets like these.
Yeah. Where do you see that? Because you, of course, found a lot of places where there's still a long way to go. I'd love to hear, where do you think that there are these persistent gaps and barriers that we're just not really getting through?
Yeah, so I think that the thing is that the data is it's a lagging indicator, right? And we know that like venture is a long cycle game, and on average, most funds now are taking up to 14 years to return, as opposed to 10 when we sort of started out. So I think at the end of the day, although we have seen the needle move a bit in terms of representation in the fund level, where we're really not seeing is that that's not trickling down to the founder level yet. And so I think a lot of that does have to do with, we need to continue, and that's where programs like our career development program to try to get more folks at the partner level are really important. And look, you're right. You mentioned earlier there's been a huge migration out of venture, and part of that is just market forces, and part of that is also, look, only so many people can become partners in a fund. We know this, right? Like, and I'm not here saying that everyone should be a VC, or even that every startup should get venture funding, right? Like, it's not for everyone. But it's more about making sure that those who truly, have done the hard work and have the skill set can reach that, and that there's not other external factors and biases that are preventing them from doing so. And so I think that, part of what we need is we need to see more diversity at the decision-making level, and that is when we will finally start to see more of that, the money going into more diverse founders. And that's where I think LPs play a really critical role, right? And so LPs being the investors in the VC funds themselves, a lot of them, we still see them asking for and collecting data on, who's in the funds. And this is where it goes to, like, collecting data is great, but if you're not going to use it, then sort of like, why are you doing it? And so, if we would love to see more LPs, for example, actually saying, okay, we've been tracking you for a while. You're coming back to us for the next fund. Look, we told you we cared about this. How are you planning on how are you fostering the next generation of partners in your fund? And how are you thinking about diversity within that context? It's very unusual for a fund to add a partner unless they're raising, right? A next fund. And nobody wants to feel like they were chosen as like a diversity hire. But it's more about how are you creating the structures and processes internally in your fund so that those people, you're fostering that next generation of talent. And then it's it's like, hey, we're raising this next fund. We have this person who's been showing themselves to be really incredible at a principal level. Maybe it's time that we promote them in.
I'd love to ask you, what do you feel like there's like stubborn misconceptions in the market and by VCs and maybe even LPs that you would wish we could get through?
I think the big one is that somehow hiring for diversity means lowering the bar. I actually think it's raising the bar because you're increasing the pool of people that you are hiring from. And again, I'll just point folks to Matthew Sade's Rebel Ideas because, we are trying to solve some of the world's most complex problems, which means we need brains that are thinking in all different ways. And also diversity, we talk about diversity a lot as something that is visually apparent, but there are so many different types of diversity, and so there's lots of hidden disabilities that people cannot necessarily see, even just like looking at the two of us, okay, sure, we're both white people, but like there's so much more to our identities than that, right? Like we were talking before this about the fact that my last name comes from my grandparents who were Holocaust survivors from Austria. And so, that informs a whole lot of who I am and why I do this work. And that's not something that somebody's going to know just by looking at me.
Yeah. There's one other stubborn saying or view that I would love your take on, and that's the we're lagging the raw input, so to say, to be able to invest in founders of other origin or whatever. Do you buy that? Or do you think it's not, it's a lazy answer, like your deal flow funnel is too much relying on your bro network?
Yeah. Um, I think it's funny. This came up over conversation recently, is because you're right. A lot of people will say that, right? It's like, oh, there's no pipeline. Um, there is. You just have to do the work. It's the same with hiring, right? It's like, okay, you can go to a lot of funds will use recruiters. And a lot of the funds in our networks will actually tell the recruiters, hey, we want it because there's research, right, that shows that if you have a short list that has at least 50% women and men, and then when you conduct those interviews, that you have at least two people who are doing the interviews who are women, you're 75% more likely to choose a woman.
That's interesting.
And that's not because like you're going out there looking to hire a woman. It's because you're just making sure that every step of the way there you have a diverse list of people that you are looking at. And so the same goes, quite frankly, for investing, right? And so there are all kinds of events out there where that are showcasing founders from many different backgrounds. It's just like making sure you're showing up. And I get it. Everyone is busy. But the other thing you can do is, for example, having the opportunity for founders to reach out to you cold, either via LinkedIn or via your website. Use a form. And again, yes, a lot of people will say we get so many inbound. We're looking at thousands of pitch decks a month. I get it. I've been there. I was a VC before I took on this role. It's true. But also, there's so much technology these days to help us sort through things. And while I will say, look, data and AI, for example, are only as good as their inputs and how they're trained. So be careful with them, right? Because they can just reinforce biases. I think there's also some role there to play in terms of helping us to sort through the information. And so I guess yes, I'm saying I think it's a lazy answer.
Yeah. No, well, responding that it's a lazy answer and just leaving it there would not be very helpful. But I think you covered a lot of ground in terms of saying, this is why I think it's a lazy answer. Meghan, I like closing these quick episodes with giving you the opportunity to give a CTA to the people that have been tuning in. What would you like to say to them?
Say, do collect the data if you're going to use it, right? Don't do it if you're not going to use it because you're creating expectation by asking people for that information. And specifically for, I'll just give two really quick examples of how I think that both on the VC side and the LP side, you can use that data. For VCs, if you're collecting pipeline data, analyze it, understand where people are dropping off in your funnel, and then ask yourself the question why. Like really try to understand why. Because without doing that, then you're collecting the data and it's just kind of sitting there and quite frankly, it's useless. On the LP side, again, and I know I said this earlier, but just if you're collecting this data, which is great, but you need to actually hold your funds accountable to create change. And at the end of the day, like the LP is the one that has the most power here. And so we do see that when LPs put pressure and say, this matters to us, things change. So use that carrot.
Meghan, thank you so much for all the important work you're doing. I would entice anyone who has been tuning in today to check out Diversity VC's work. I think it's incredibly important to make people smarter, but at the same time, you also have a lot of materials that people can go and apply to help them get forward moving on this agenda. Meghan, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andreas.